They took her baby at dawn. The sun was a smear of bloody yolk behind the sawtooth peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, staining the dust-choked air of Redding County a sickly orange. Retta Morvan didn't scream. She didn't beg. She had done her begging in the weeks prior, in Sheriff Cole's office, where the air was stale with the smell of cheap cigars and injustice. She had pleaded with the women of the town, their faces pinched and closed like fists, their eyes sliding away from hers as if her grief were a contagion. No, when his deputies, their badges winking like cruel stars in the half-light, kicked open her cabin door, she was silent. She stood by the cold hearth, a statue carved from sleepless nights and watered-down coffee, and watched them go to the cradle her husband had built. Boone, her Boone, just 6 months old, was wrapped in a wool blanket she'd shorn and spun herself. He didn't cry, not at first. He just blinked his wide, dark eyes, the same eyes as his father, and made a small, questioning sound in his throat. One of the deputies, a boy with pimples and the vacuous stare of a calf, scooped him up. That's when Boone started to wail, a thin, piercing sound that sliced through the morning quiet and lodged itself in Retta's ribs. It was a sound she knew would never leave her. She watched them carry him out, his tiny body rigid with terror, his cries trailing behind him like a banner of her failure. Sheriff Cole stood on her porch, a thick, satisfied man whose shadow always seemed to fall on whatever he wanted. He held a piece of paper, the court order declaring her an unfit mother. The words were a brand, searing into her. Unfit. Because her husband was dead, killed in a mine collapse the company called an act of God and the men called greed. Unfit. Because she had no family left to speak for her. Unfit. Because her land, the Morvan homestead with its deep well and patch of workable soil, was the last piece of green in a valley the cattle barons and the railroad were choking dry. Cole didn't look at her. He looked at her land, his gaze lingering on the wellhead like a thirsty man. "It's for the boy's own good, Retta," he said, his voice a greasy platitude. "He'll be cared for, properly." She didn't answer. She just watched the dust settle where the wagon had been, the sound of Boone's crying already fading, swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The silence he left behind was louder than any scream. It was a hollow, ringing void where her heart used to be. She stood there until the sun was fully risen, a merciless white eye in the sky, baking the raw wound of the morning. Then she turned and went back inside. She didn't weep. Tears were a luxury, a waste of salt and water. Instead, she moved with a chilling, deliberate calm. She took the last of the flour and made a small, hard biscuit. She drank the last of the coffee. She looked at the cradle, empty now, the indentation of his small head still visible in the thin mattress. A tremor went through her, a violent, seismic shudder that started in her feet and threatened to tear her apart. She clamped her jaw shut, her teeth grinding until her gums bled. The fury was a living thing inside her, a white-hot coal in her belly. But it was a cold fury, a calculated rage. They had declared her unfit. They had judged her and found her wanting. They had taken her son. They had made a mistake. They thought they had broken her. They had, in fact, created her. At dusk, she climbed out of a coffin she paid for herself and carried a shotgun older than her name. The coffin was cheap pine, smelling of resin and finality. She'd gone to the undertaker that afternoon, her face a mask of vacant sorrow. Old Man Hemlock, a creature of dust and formaldehyde, had clucked his tongue in sympathy. "A tragedy," he'd murmured, peering at her from beneath bushy white eyebrows. "To lose a husband and a child in the same year. The Lord tests the righteous." Retta had just nodded, her eyes fixed on the plainest box in his workshop. "I've got no one left," she'd whispered, the words scraping her throat. "Nowhere to go. I've been saving for a final piece." She paid him with the last of the money she'd hidden from the bank, the coins her husband had given her, one by one, telling her to keep them for a rainy day. It was raining now. A deluge. Hemlock, greedy and incurious, had taken the money and asked no more questions. He agreed to leave the coffin in the back of his workshop, behind a stack of lumber, for her to say her goodbyes in private. He thought she was coming back to put a bullet in her own head. Let him. Let them all think she was broken. Let them find her cabin empty, a cold suicide note on the table. Let them bury an empty box. Her own grave was a hiding place, a chrysalis. She had spent the afternoon there, in the dark, the lid propped open just a crack. The air was thick and close, the scent of sawdust filling her lungs. She didn't move. She listened. She listened to the sounds of the town shutting down for the night, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant laughter from the saloon, the slow, rhythmic tread of the night watchman. She had memorized their patterns. She knew which deputy was on duty at the jail, the one who drank from a flask and sometimes dozed off in his chair around midnight. She knew the back alley that ran behind the jailhouse, the one littered with broken bottles and shadowed by the overhanging roof of the livery stable. She had spent the last weeks not just grieving, but watching, observing, learning the clockwork of this town that had condemned her. Her grief was not a weakness, it was a whetstone. It had sharpened her senses, honed her focus to a razor's edge. Now, in the deep purple of twilight, she pushed the lid of the coffin open. It groaned in protest. She swung her legs over the side, her boots making no sound on the dirt floor. The shotgun was leaning against the wall where she'd hidden it. It was her father's gun, a heavy, double-barreled greener. The stock was worn smooth from his hands, the metal cool and solid in hers. She broke it open, the click of the mechanism unnaturally loud in the silence. She took 2 shells from the pocket of her canvas trousers. They were heavy, filled with buckshot. She slid them into the chambers, her movements economical and precise. She snapped the gun shut. The sound was a promise, a vow. She slung a leather satchel over her shoulder. Inside was a coil of rope, a flask of water, a small hard loaf of bread, and a bundle of rags soaked in kerosene. In another pocket, tucked away and wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, hand-carved wooden bird, the last toy her husband had made for Boone. She moved to the back door of the undertaker's shop. The lock was old and simple. She used a piece of wire she'd taken from her own fence to pick it, her fingers steady, her mind clear. The lock gave with a soft click. She slipped out into the alley, a ghost in the gathering dark. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. She kept to the shadows, her body a fluid line against the rough-hewn walls of the buildings. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. Good. The darkness was her ally. It was the same darkness they had cast her into, and now she would wear it like a shroud. She could hear the tinny piano from the saloon, a cheerful, oblivious sound that grated on her nerves. The whole town was oblivious. They were sleeping, or drinking, or praying, secure in their beds, their laws, their righteousness. They had forgotten about her. They had written her off as another poor, broken woman. They had no idea what was coming for them. They had no idea that the woman they had buried was rising from her grave, not with a prayer on her lips, but with a shotgun in her hands and a fire in her heart that would burn their world to the ground. She was no longer Retta Morvan, the grieving widow. She was a mother, and she was coming for her son. The jailhouse was a squat, ugly building made of stone and reinforced timber, a boil on the face of the town. A single lamp burned in the front window, casting a sickly yellow rectangle onto the dusty street. Retta didn't go to the front. She circled around, her feet silent in the dirt, the shotgun held low against her leg. The back alley was as she remembered, narrow, stinking of piss and stale beer. The window to the back room, the room where they kept the records, and sometimes a prisoner they wanted to keep quiet, was high and small, too high to climb. But the roof of the livery stable next door was low, its shingles warped and peeling. This was her way in. She uncoiled the rope from her satchel. At one end, she had fashioned a small three-pronged grappling hook from a bent piece of rebar she'd found near the mine. She swung it once, twice, a silent, deadly pendulum in the dark. On the third swing, she let it fly. It sailed upwards, a dark bird against the bruised sky, and landed on the livery roof with a soft thud. She tugged on it, testing its hold. It was secure. She slung the shotgun over her back, the barrel cold against her neck. Then she began to climb. Her muscles, hardened by years of farm work, screamed in protest, but she ignored them. The pain was a distant thing, a buzzing insect she could swat away. The only thing that mattered was the weight of the empty space in her arms where her son should be. She reached the edge of the roof, her fingers scrabbling for a hold on the rough shingles. She pulled herself up, her body trembling with exertion. She lay flat for a moment, catching her breath, her cheek pressed against the tar and dust surface. From here she could see the whole town laid out before her, a scattering of dim lights in a vast, dark wilderness. It looked peaceful. It was a lie. This town was a predator, and she was the prey that had learned to bite back. The jailhouse window was directly across from her, a small, dark square in the stone wall. The gap was about 10 feet. Too far to jump. She had planned for this. She crawled to the edge of the livery roof, the grappling hook still in her hand. She leaned over, her heart hammering against her ribs, and swung the hook again, this time aiming for the iron bars of the window. It took 3 tries. The first 2 times the hook clanged loudly against the stone, the sound echoing in the silent alley. She froze each time, her breath held, listening for any sign that she had been heard. Nothing. The deputy was either drunker or more asleep than she'd hoped. On the 3rd try, the hook caught. It snagged on the crossbar, its prongs biting into the rusted iron. She pulled on the rope, hard. It held. Now came the hardest part. She tied the other end of the rope around her waist, a double knot she'd practiced 100 times in the dark of her cabin. She took a deep breath, the air thin and cold. She looked down at the dark alley below. A fall would mean a broken neck, or worse, capture, failure. The thought of Boone's face, his wide, trusting eyes, pushed the fear away. She would not fail. She swung her legs over the edge of the roof, her boots dangling in the empty air. She gripped the rope with both hands, her knuckles white. She began to move across, hand over hand, her body suspended over the abyss. The rope creaked and groaned, the sound magnified in the stillness. Her arms burned, her shoulders felt as if they were being torn from their sockets. She focused on the window, on the darkness beyond it. Boone was in there, somewhere, in a cell, or a back room, or a makeshift nursery. He was breathing this same stale air, sleeping under this same corrupt roof. The thought gave her a fresh surge of strength. She reached the wall, her boots finding purchase on the rough-hewn stone. She hung there, plastered against the side of the jailhouse like a spider, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The window was just above her. She reached up, her fingers finding the edge of the sill. She pulled herself up, her muscles screaming, until her eyes were level with the opening. The room inside was dark, filled with the shadows of filing cabinets and a large roll-top desk. It smelled of paper and dust and mice. It was empty. She worked quickly. She took a small, flat piece of iron from her pocket and began to work it between the window frame and the wall. The wood was old and soft. It splintered easily. After a few minutes of patient, silent work, she had pried the frame loose. She pushed it inwards. It fell to the floor with a soft thud. She listened again. Still nothing. She untied the rope from her waist and pushed her satchel through the opening. Then, she squeezed her own body through, her hips and shoulders scraping against the rough stone. She landed on the floor in a crouch, the shotgun held ready. The jailhouse was silent, except for a low, rhythmic snoring coming from the front office. Deputy Miller, right on schedule. She moved through the office, a shadow among shadows. The snoring grew louder. She peered into the main office. Miller was slumped in his chair, his hat tilted over his eyes, an empty bottle of whiskey on the desk beside him. His gun belt was hanging on a peg on the wall. Fool. She didn't spare him a second glance. He was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was sleeping in his bed in the big house on the hill. The cells were at the back. There were 4 of them, 2 on each side of a narrow corridor. The first 2 were empty. The third held a drunk, sleeping it off, his snores a counterpoint to Miller's. And the fourth cell was different. There was a small, clean cot in the corner, and on it, a wooden crate that had been fashioned into a makeshift crib, and inside the crib, a small, sleeping form. Boone. Her breath caught in her throat. A wave of love so fierce it was painful washed over her. He was here. He was safe, for now. But he was sleeping in a cage built by the man who had stolen him. The rage, which had been a cold, hard thing in her belly, now flared hot and bright. She looked at her son, so small, so vulnerable, and she knew that what she was about to do was not just vengeance. It was justice. The only kind of justice this town would ever understand. She reached through the bars, her fingers trembling, and gently touched his cheek. He stirred in his sleep, a soft sighing sound. She pulled her hand back. Not yet. First, she had work to do. She turned away from the cell, her face set like stone. She moved back to the records room. She found what she was looking for in a large, leather-bound ledger, the deed to her land. It was filed under him for Morven, but a new name had been penciled in beside it. Cole. He hadn't even waited for her body to be cold. He had already claimed it. She took the ledger and the kerosene-soaked rags from her satchel. She went to the center of the office, near Miller's desk. She opened the ledger to the page with her name on it. She laid the rags on top of it. She took out a match. The sound of it striking was like a gunshot in the silence. The flame flared, a tiny defiant star in the darkness. She held it to the rags. They caught fire with a soft whoosh, the flames greedily consuming the paper, the ink, the lies. The firelight danced on her face, illuminating the cold, hard fury in her eyes. She watched as Cole's name turned to black ash. She watched as the record of his theft was erased from the world. The smoke began to fill the room, thick and acrid. The fire spread, catching on the papers on the desk, the wooden floorboards. Soon, the whole building would be an inferno. She had to get Boone out. She ran back to the cells. The keys were on a ring on the wall, next to Miller's gun belt. She grabbed them, her hands fumbling in her haste. She found the key that fit the cell door. The lock was stiff and rusted. It took all her strength to turn it. The door creaked open. She rushed to the crib. Boone was awake now, his eyes wide with fear at the smell of the smoke and the flickering light. He started to cry, that same thin, piercing wail that had haunted her since dawn. "Shh, baby, shh," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Mama's here. Mama's got you." She scooped him up, holding him tight against her chest. He was so small, so warm. He smelled of soap and milk and innocence. He buried his face in her neck, his crying subsiding to a series of hiccuping sobs. She held him for a moment, just a moment, breathing him in, reassuring herself that he was real, that he was hers. The fire was roaring now, the flames licking at the ceiling, the smoke so thick it was hard to breathe. She slung the shotgun over her shoulder, cradled Boone in one arm, and ran. She didn't look back. She ran out the back door, into the cool night air, leaving the jailhouse to burn. She ran through the alley, her feet pounding the earth, her son held safe in her arms. She didn't stop running until she was clear of the town, until the burning jailhouse was just a distant, angry glow against the dark horizon. She had her son. But it wasn't over. It had just begun. Cole would come for her. He would hunt her. But she would be ready. She was no longer the prey. She was the hunter now, and she would not rest until he had paid for what he had done. Not with fire, not with ashes, but with his own blood. The desert at night was a different world. The heat of the day bled away, leaving a chill that seeped into the bones. The sky was a vast, star-dusted canopy, so clear and deep it felt like you could fall into it. Retta found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the side of a rocky mesa, a place she knew from her childhood, a place no one else would think to look. It was small, barely big enough for her and Boone, but it was hidden. It was safe. For now. She laid Boone down on a bed of dry leaves and soft grass she'd gathered. He was asleep again, his small face peaceful in the faint starlight. She watched him for a long time, her heart a painful knot in her chest. She had him back. But for how long? Cole would not let this go. The burning of the jail, the theft of his property. He would see it as a personal affront. He would raise a posse. He would scour the county for her. He would not stop until she was dead or in chains. She knew this. She was counting on it. She was not running. She was waiting. She was setting a trap. She took the small, hand-carved bird from her satchel and placed it in Boone's hand. His tiny fingers closed around it instinctively. A fresh wave of grief and rage washed over her. Grief for the husband she had lost, the man who had carved this bird with such love and care. Rage for the man who had tried to take everything from her. She pushed the grief down. It was a fuel, and she would need it. She checked her supplies. The water in her flask was low, the bread was almost gone. The shotgun had only 2 shells. It was not enough. Not for a siege. Not for a war. She needed more. She needed help. There was only one person she could turn to. A person as much an outcast as she was. A person who owed her a debt. The thought of him made her skin crawl, but she had no choice. She had to go to him. She would wait until dawn. Then she would leave Boone in the cave, hidden and safe, and she would go to the old Apache camp on the far side of the valley. She would go to a man named Silas, a man who knew how to fight, how to kill, and how to survive in this unforgiving land. A man who hated Sheriff Cole even more than she did. The thought was a cold comfort, but it was something. She sat at the mouth of the cave, the shotgun across her lap, and watched the stars. She did not sleep. She listened to the sounds of the desert night, the yip of a distant coyote, the rustle of a snake in the dry grass, the soft, steady breathing of her son. Each sound was a reminder of what was at stake, everything. She was a mother protecting her child. It was the oldest story in the world, and it always ended in blood. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gray. Retta kissed Boone's forehead, his skin soft and warm against her chapped lips. "Be good, my love," she whispered. "Mama will be back." She had left him a small pool of water in a hollowed-out rock, and the last of the bread, crumbled into small, manageable pieces. It wasn't enough, but it would have to do. She couldn't take him with her. The journey was too dangerous, the destination even more so. She covered the mouth of the cave with a lattice of thorny branches, obscuring it from view. It was a flimsy defense, but it was the best she could do. She took one last look at her sleeping son, then turned and began the long walk across the valley. The sun climbed higher, beating down on her with a relentless, punishing heat. The land was stark and beautiful, a canvas of red rock, pale sand, and skeletal trees. But there was no beauty in it for her today. There was only the grim determination of her purpose. It took her most of the day to reach the Apache camp. It wasn't a camp anymore, not really, just a collection of crumbling adobe huts and the ghosts of a people who had been driven from their land. But Silas was still there. He lived in the largest of the huts, a solitary, brooding figure, as much a relic as the camp itself. He was sitting outside when she arrived, sharpening a long, wicked-looking knife on a whetstone. He was a tall, lean man, his face a mask of scars and hard-earned wrinkles. His eyes, dark and piercing, missed nothing. He saw her coming from a long way off, but he didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence until she was standing right in front of him. "Retta," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't sound surprised to see her. "I heard the jailhouse burn down." "You hear a lot of things, Silas," she said, her own voice hoarse from thirst and disuse. "I need your help." He set the knife and the whetstone down, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at her, his gaze taking in her dusty clothes, her sunburnt face, the raw desperation in her eyes. Help with what? Cole took my son. The words were flat, devoid of emotion. She would not show him her weakness. I took him back. A flicker of something, respect, amusement, passed through his eyes. So I heard, and now Cole is hunting you. Yes. And you want me to help you kill him? It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. I want you to help me survive, she corrected him. The killing part is mine. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. She waited, her patience a thin, frayed thread. She knew he had no love for Cole. The sheriff had been responsible for the death of Silas's family years ago, during the last of the Apache Wars. Cole had called it a pacification. Silas called it a massacre, but Silas was a man who kept to himself. He had long since given up on the world of men and their petty squabbles. Why should I help you? He finally asked, his voice soft, almost gentle. It's not my fight. You owe me, she said, her voice equally soft, but with an edge of steel. My father saved your life. He hid you in our barn when Cole's men were hunting you. He fed you. He treated your wounds. He asked for nothing in return. Silas's face tightened, the scars standing out in sharp relief. He remembered. She knew he would. A debt, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Yes, a debt. He looked at her again, a long, searching look. He saw the shotgun in her hand, the fire in her eyes, the unyielding set of her jaw. He saw a woman who had been pushed too far, a woman who had nothing left to lose. He saw himself. He stood up, a towering, formidable figure. All right, Retta, he said, his voice firm. I'll help you, but we do this my way. Cole is a snake, but he's a cunning snake. We can't just go after him head on. We have to be smarter. We have to be more ruthless. He led her to his hut. It was sparse and clean, the air thick with the smell of herbs and wood smoke. He gave her water, a thick, nourishing stew, and a place to rest. She told him everything, about the cave, about Boone, about her meager supplies. He listened without interruption, his face impassive. When she was finished, he nodded. The boy is safe for now, he said. Cole will be looking for you in the hills, not the desert. But we don't have much time. We need to prepare. For the next 2 days, they worked. Silas taught her things she never thought she would need to know. He taught her how to move silently through the desert, how to use the land as both a weapon and a shield. He taught her how to set snares and traps, how to find water where there seemed to be none. He taught her how to shoot, not just the shotgun, but a rifle, a pistol, a bow. He was a patient, demanding teacher, and she was a quick, desperate student. She learned to load and fire the rifle until her shoulder was a mass of purple bruises. She learned to handle the pistol until it felt like an extension of her own hand. She learned to aim the bow with a steady, unwavering eye. She was no longer just a farmer's wife. She was becoming a warrior. On the 3rd day, a scout Silas had sent out returned. He brought news. Cole had raised a posse of 20 men. They were combing the foothills, armed to the teeth with orders to shoot on sight. They had found her empty cabin. They had found the empty coffin. They knew she was alive. And they were coming for her. It's time, Silas said, his voice grim. They'll be here by tomorrow. Retta's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drum against her ribs. But her hands were steady, her mind was clear. She was ready. She looked at Silas, at his scarred, weathered face, and saw not a stranger, but a kindred spirit. They were 2 ghosts, haunted by the same man, bound by a shared desire for justice. Let them come, she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. We'll be waiting. They spent the rest of the day setting the trap. They chose a narrow canyon, a natural bottleneck with high, rocky walls. They rigged deadfalls, pits lined with sharpened stakes, and tripwires connected to explosives Silas had fashioned from gunpowder and old tin cans. They created a kill zone, a place where Cole's posse would be funneled, confused, and vulnerable. As night fell, they took their positions on the canyon rim, hidden among the rocks. Retta's stomach was a tight, cold knot. She thought of Boone, alone in the cave, and a fresh wave of fear and determination washed over her. She was doing this for him. She was fighting for his future, for a life free from the shadow of men like Cole. She looked at the shotgun in her hands, the 2 shells in its chambers. She had saved them for a special purpose. She had saved them for Cole. The moon rose, casting long, eerie shadows across the canyon floor. The world was silent, holding its breath. And then, in the distance, she heard it. The sound of horses, the jingle of harnesses, the low murmur of men's voices. They were coming. Retta took a deep breath, the desert air cool and clean in her lungs. She settled the stock of the shotgun against her shoulder, her cheek pressed against the cold wood. She sighted down the barrel, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. She was calm. She was focused. She was ready. The long night was over. The dawn of her vengeance was at hand. The posse rode into the canyon with the careless arrogance of men who believe they are the hunters. They were a motley crew of ranch hands, barflies, and sycophants, all eager to earn the sheriff's favor. Cole rode at their head, a big man on a big horse, his face flushed with anger and self-importance. He was not a man accustomed to being defied. He saw the burned-out jailhouse not as a symbol of a mother's desperation, but as a personal insult. He saw Retta not as a grieving woman, but as a challenge to his authority. He would make an example of her. He would hang her high, a warning to anyone else who dared to question his rule. They were halfway into the canyon when the first trap was sprung. A tripwire, stretched taut across the narrow path, was snagged by one of the lead horses. The wire pulled a pin from a precariously balanced pile of rocks on the canyon rim. With a low rumble, the rocks tumbled down, a deadly avalanche of stone and dust. The men shouted in alarm, their horses rearing and screaming in terror. One man was crushed instantly, his body disappearing under the cascade of rock. Another was thrown from his horse, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The posse was thrown into chaos. They were trapped, the path ahead blocked by the rock slide, the narrow canyon walls preventing them from scattering. "It's an ambush!" someone screamed, his voice high with panic. "Hold your ground!" Cole roared, trying to restore order. He drew his pistol, his eyes scanning the canyon rim, searching for the source of the attack. But he saw nothing, only rocks and shadows. That's when Silas gave the signal. A low, mournful bird call that echoed through the canyon. It was the signal for the second phase of the attack. From hidden positions on both sides of the canyon, arrows began to fly. They were silent, deadly messengers, striking with pinpoint accuracy. Men cried out in pain and surprise, clutching at shafts that had sprouted from their chests, their throats, their arms. Horses, wounded and terrified, bolted, throwing their riders and adding to the confusion. Retta watched from her perch, her heart a cold, steady rhythm in her chest. She did not feel pity. She did not feel remorse. These men had come to kill her, to take her from her son forever. They were not men. They were obstacles. She raised her rifle, the one Silas had given her. She sighted on a man who was trying to take cover behind a rock, his pistol blazing uselessly at the shadows. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the report echoing through the canyon. The man jerked, a red flower blooming on his chest, and then collapsed. She worked the bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge, chambering a new one. Her movements were smooth, efficient, mechanical. She was a machine built for one purpose, to protect her child. Down below, the posse was disintegrating. Some men were trying to fight back, firing wildly at the unseen enemy. Others were trying to flee, scrambling back the way they had come, only to find their retreat cut off by another smaller rock slide triggered by Silas. They were caught in a box, a shooting gallery of their own making. Cole was still on his horse, a figure of impotent rage. He fired his pistol at the shadows, his face a mask of fury. He was screaming, cursing her name, promising a slow and painful death. Retta ignored him. He was not her target. Not yet. She and Silas worked in tandem, their shots precise and devastating. They were not trying to kill everyone. They were trying to break them, to shatter their morale, to turn their arrogance into terror. And it was working. Men were throwing down their weapons, crying for mercy. They were no longer a posse. They were a terrified mob. After 10 minutes that felt like an eternity, it was over. The canyon was filled with the sounds of the wounded and the dying. The survivors, a handful of them, were huddled together, their hands raised in surrender. Cole was still on his horse, his pistol empty, his face pale with shock and disbelief. He had been defeated, humiliated, by a woman he had dismissed as weak and broken. Silas stood up from his hiding place, a tall, imposing figure against the morning sky. He held his rifle loosely in one hand. "It's over, Cole," he called out, his voice ringing with authority. "Drop your gun." Cole stared at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and fear. He knew who Silas was. He knew the history between them. He hesitated for a moment, his hand still gripping the empty pistol. Retta rose from her own hiding place, the shotgun held ready. She was on the opposite side of the canyon, creating a crossfire. There was no escape. Cole's eyes darted from Silas to Retta, his mind racing. He was trapped, but he was not a man who surrendered. He was a man who would rather die than admit defeat. With a roar of rage, he spurred his horse, charging not at Silas, but at the rock slide, trying to force his way through, to escape. It was a foolish, desperate move. And it was the mistake Retta had been waiting for. She raised the shotgun, the one she had saved for him. She didn't need to aim. At this range, it was impossible to miss. She pulled the first trigger. The shotgun roared, a deafening blast that echoed through the canyon. The buckshot tore into the horse's flank. The animal screamed, a high, piercing sound, and collapsed, its legs buckling beneath it. Cole was thrown from the saddle, landing hard on the rocky ground. He lay there for a moment, stunned. The wind knocked out of him. He pushed himself up, his face a mask of dirt and blood. He had lost his hat, his hair matted with sweat. He looked up and saw her, standing on the canyon rim, the shotgun still aimed at him. Their eyes met across the distance. In that moment, he saw her not as a woman, but as an avenging angel, a figure of righteous fury sent to deliver his judgment. He fumbled for the pistol on his hip, the one he always carried in reserve. He was fast, but she was faster. She pulled the second trigger. The blast was even louder than the first, a final, definitive statement. The shot caught him in the chest, lifting him off his feet and slamming him back against the rocks. He slid down, leaving a smear of red on the stone. He lay still, his eyes open, staring at the sky he would no longer see. A stunned silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the moans of the wounded. It was done. Sheriff Cole was dead. Retta stood there for a long moment, the shotgun smoking in her hands. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel joy. She felt only a vast, empty quiet. The fire of her rage had been quenched, leaving behind only the cold ashes of her grief. She had done what she had to do. She had protected her son. She had claimed her justice. Silas came to stand beside her. He looked down at the carnage in the canyon, his face unreadable. "It's over," he said softly. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not. Not until I have my son." She turned and started the long walk back to the cave, leaving the dead and the dying behind her. The sun was high in the sky now, a merciless, indifferent eye. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope, a tiny, fragile flame in the darkness. She had faced the monster and won. Now she was going home. The journey back was a blur. Retta moved on pure instinct, her body numb, her mind a hollow chamber echoing with the thunder of the shotgun. The desert landscape, which had seemed so hostile on her way out, now felt like a sanctuary. It was a place of clean, brutal honesty, a place that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Unlike the town, unlike the men she had left dead or dying in the canyon. She reached the cave as the sun began to set, painting the western sky in hues of blood and fire. Her heart was a frantic bird in her chest. Was he safe? Was he still there? She pushed aside the thorny branches, her hands scratched and bleeding, and crawled inside. He was there. He was sitting up, playing with the small wooden bird, gurgling happily to himself. He looked up as she entered, his face breaking into a wide, toothless grin. "Ma," he said, the sound a perfect, beautiful syllable. A sob, raw and powerful, tore itself from her throat. It was the first sound of weakness she had allowed herself since they had taken him. She crawled to him, gathering him up in her arms, burying her face in his soft, warm hair. She held him tight, as if she could physically fuse him to her, so that no one could ever take him away again. He wrapped his tiny arms around her neck, his small body a perfect fit against hers. The empty space in her arms, the hollow ache in her soul, was finally, blessedly full. They stayed like that for a long time, a tableau of reunion in the fading light. The mother and the child, the beginning and the end of everything. When she finally pulled back, she saw the smudges of dirt on his face, the tear tracks from when he had woken up alone and afraid, and the rage, which she thought had been extinguished, stirred again. Not the hot, all-consuming fire from before, but a cold, hard ember that she knew would never die. Cole was dead, but the town that had created him, the people who had stood by and let him do what he did, they were still there. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She spent the night in the cave with Boone, sleeping for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She slept with him curled in her arms, the shotgun by her side. She dreamed of fire and smoke, of her husband's face, of Boone's first smile. She woke at dawn, refreshed and resolute. She had a choice to make. She could take Boone and disappear, run to a new territory, a new life, start over, or she could go back. She could face the town. She could claim what was hers, not just her son, but her land, her home, her name. The thought of running was tempting. It was the easy path, the safe path. But as she looked at her son, sleeping peacefully in her arms, she knew she couldn't do it. She couldn't spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. She couldn't raise her son to be a fugitive. He was a Morven. This was his land. They would not be driven from it. She would go back. But not as a supplicant, not as a victim. She would go back as a conqueror. She would walk into that town in broad daylight, her son in her arms and her shotgun on her shoulder. And they would see her. They would all see her. And they would know that the law of men had failed, and the law of a mother had prevailed. The next morning, she started the journey back to Redding. It was a different kind of journey. She was not hiding. She was not sneaking. She walked on the main road, her head held high. People saw her. A farmer in his wagon, his eyes wide with disbelief. A group of children playing by the creek, who stopped and stared as she passed. The news of the Canyon massacre had surely reached the town by now. They knew Cole was dead. They knew she was alive. They didn't know what to expect. Fear was a powerful weapon, and she would use it. She reached the outskirts of town in the late afternoon. It was Sunday. The streets were quiet, most of the townsfolk at the weekly church service. The sound of a hymn, thin and reedy, drifted on the wind. It was the perfect time. She walked down the main street, her boots kicking up dust. The town looked the same, but it felt different. The air was thick with tension, with unspoken questions. Windows were shuttered, doors were barred. The town was holding its breath. She didn't go to her cabin. She went straight to the center of town, to the one place she knew everyone would have to face her. She went to the church. The hymn faltered and died as she pushed open the heavy oak doors. The preacher, a man with a weak chin and watery eyes, stopped mid-sermon, his mouth agape. Every head in the congregation turned to look at her. They saw a woman they thought was dead, a woman they had condemned. They saw the shotgun in her hands, the hard, unyielding look in her eyes. They saw the baby in her arms, his dark eyes taking in the silent, staring crowd. A collective gasp went through the room. This was not a ghost. This was something far more terrifying. This was a reckoning. She walked down the central aisle, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The people shrank away from her, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. She walked to the front of the church, to the baptismal font. It was a large marble basin, filled with what was supposed to be holy water. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small leather pouch. She opened it and poured its contents into the font. Gunpowder. The black powder swirled in the water, turning it dark and profane. It was a baptism of a different kind, a baptism of fire and blood. She turned to face the congregation, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent church. "You judged me," she said, her gaze sweeping over their faces, lingering on the ones who had turned their backs on her, the ones who had whispered behind their hands. "You called me unfit. You stood by and let a thief in a badge steal my son. You prayed to your God for salvation while you let the devil rule your town." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Your God didn't answer you. Your law didn't protect you. Your sheriff is dead. And I am here." She looked at the preacher, who was trembling, his face as white as his collar. "There will be a new law in this town," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "My law, the law of a mother. You will not harm my son. You will not touch my land. You will not speak my name without respect." She let the silence stretch, thick and heavy. No one moved. No one spoke. They were mesmerized, terrified, by the sheer force of her will. She had faced down a posse. She had killed their sheriff. They had no doubt that she would kill any one of them who dared to cross her. She didn't ask for her baby back. She just held out her arms, and he reached.